Hi, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Um, I I wonder if you can start by telling me how you got to become interested in this issue of, I suppose, gender identity, but more specifically, the transitioning of young women and girls.
Okay, so I actually wasn't. I had already submitted a proposal to my agent, which he liked, about a feminist book about sort of a contemporary feminist update, how girls were doing and what they needed to do, and how were they doing, and sort of what we could learn about that, and how should they be doing, and that sort of thing. And then I wrote a piece. I sort of wanted to avoid the trans issue. I started out. I wrote a piece on the. I'm a lawyer, and I wrote a piece about the pronoun laws. We have pronoun laws in two states that say you can have criminal penalties for misgendering someone, and that's totally unconstitutional in America. We have really strong First Amendment, as you know, and the government can't make people say anything. It doesn't matter why. The government can't even make people salute a flag. So I pointed that out, and a woman wrote to me, and she told me about basically ROGD. She said, this is a real phenomenon. My daughter was caught up in it. She was always a girly girl, had boyfriends. Actually, her daughter happened to be straight, but she had boyfriends, went off to college. She had a lot of mental health problems, but she went off to college, and with a group of friends, they all decided they were trans. The girl had always had trouble fitting in and whatnot. And they all decided they were trans, and she started testosterone. And the woman told me this is happening across the country. And I didn't know what to make of it, but I sort of looked into it, and I wrote a piece about it for the Wall Street Journal, thinking, all right, I'll write one piece on this and that's it. I certainly don't want to make, enemies for a living. And it got a lot of response. And my agent got back to me, and he sort of said, well, if you're going to write about how young girls are doing, don't you think you should write about this? And it really did seem to sort of mesh with how girls were doing. It was hard not to talk about the fact that so many girls were trying to escape womanhood. I didn't know how to write a book about girls without talking about that.
Hmm. I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting because I have a manuscript unpublished that I started writing 3 maybe 4 years ago, and it was supposed to be about it is about modern feminism and like how third wave feminism has really kind of destroyed the women's movement as far as I'm concerned. And how things like social media and porn culture and sexualization and so on and so forth have really confused young women and girls in particular. And, of course, since then, the trans issue has really blown up, which I think is really connected to this, I don't know, change in focus in terms of the feminist movement, I guess you could say. Like, how would you, do you think that's accurate? How would you sort of describe that connection?
Totally. I mean, look at, the Union of American Rugby Players that just decided to bring in so-called trans women, so biological men, to play that sport. But by the way, I always clarify that biological men, not because I mean to be mean or insulting to people who consider themselves trans women, but because people don't understand what you mean by a trans woman half the time. So for readers and listeners, it's very hard. Wait, trans woman, what is that again? They're always playing that game. But anyway, biological men competing with women, they just voted to allow that. These girls are going to get so hurt. And you think about the number of the girls on the team who didn't want that but couldn't speak up because they didn't want to be considered a bigot. I mean, it's just so predictable and these girls could be terribly hurt. Rugby's a very, violent sport. I mean, these girls are throwing away, women in general are throwing away the rights that we've won with both hands. And it's worth asking what in God's name is going on.
So, why do you think that there is this sort of, I mean, I would call it like a lack of concern for not just like women's sex-based rights as a whole, but, a real lack of concern for girls and girls' well-being and girls' safety?
Okay, so I think a lot of things came together at once. One thing was that there was a big switch from I was born in 1978. And when I was growing up, we had Women's History Month. It was all about girl empowerment and looking up to these strong women. And that's what we did. And somehow in the last generation, that certainly switched, and women became yet another victim status. They became, described as weak. They're always going to get raped at school, abused in the workplace, given less pay. And this was just a constant drumbeat that being a woman wasn't that great a thing to be. We never heard that when I was a kid. You never heard that being a woman wasn't a great thing to be. We thought it was the best thing to be. And then you had the idea of gender nonconforming, which is very insidious, because the idea is, oh, I'm not conforming to being a woman because I'm so smart in math. Well, what you're saying is being a woman means being bad in math. I mean, that's what you're saying. Mm-hmm. So there were all these really negative messages. At the same time, you had this new group asking for rights, claiming it was the next civil rights frontier. And it was really hard to deny them that and to recognize that what they were really asking for in many cases, certainly the activists, was a destruction of women's rights. Women's rights mean excluding men. That's what those rights mean.
Yeah. And of course, when we're talking about women's spaces or spaces for girls, it also means excluding men. So now that we have this whole language around exclusion that is inherently and always a bad thing, it's really difficult to talk about, why, actually exclusion isn't inherently bad. Sometimes exclusion is necessary, or sometimes it just makes sense. Sometimes it's fine and it's neutral. I mean, it doesn't make sense for everybody to be included in everything all the time.
That's totally right. We lost the ability to say that. We became so Manichaean. Everything was all good or all bad, and exclusion was always bad, which of course doesn't make any sense. You know what? There's something else too, and you might totally disagree with this, but I think it's worth putting out there. I get a lot of notes. I've written about women's sports, many times. And when I do, I often get notes from fathers who think it's desperately unfair to their daughters. They are very concerned. I do think that, and I think women are in part to blame for this, men are so afraid to be mansplaining. They're so afraid to be what used to be considered chivalry and then became sexist, that they're right now don't feel like they're in a space to stand up for their daughters. So I think a lot of times you'll see online, why aren't men standing up? And I do think the response to that is because they think they're not allowed to. They're going to be called mansplainers if they do.
Yeah, I think you're right in some ways. And, and this is something that I think that I participated in when I was younger, when I was first writing about, people change, people mature, whatever. I'm not embarrassed to say that there's things that I've written in the past that I wouldn't write today, and especially when you're sort of being trained in engagement online, I think people sort of just, you learn what works and you learn what you're supposed to say, and you sort of just knee jerk into all these things without necessarily thinking through whether those are worthwhile or make sense or productive or whatever. But yeah, I think you're right, because a lot of feminists have done this thing, which is sit down and shut up. You're a man. You don't have a say. What are you doing in this conversation? Go be quiet and read a book, or just support us no matter what. Anything we say, you have to go along with and agree with. And that was a really big mistake, because now, as you pointed out, we've come to this, trans trend, and men think, oh, I have to support this because this is what the feminists are telling me to do. Because, of course, there are a lot of people who identify as feminists who say, trans women are the most oppressed people in the world. And anyone who challenges this ideology is a bigot and hateful and exclusionary, yada, yada, yada. And, I actually, it would be very confusing as a man to be what is feminism? What am I supposed to be doing as an ally, which is supposed to be what I am as a man? Maybe I'll just say nothing at all, or maybe I'll just click on this post that says trans women are women, end of conversation.
Yeah, I think I do think that's right. We've gotten so obsessed with identity and we can't even make cause on issues that are really important. So I see this a lot because, a lot of people who write to me are politically progressive and they're very uncomfortable ever joining forces, some of them, with someone on the right. And they say, well, I don't want to, basically I won't stand up for women's rights if I have to agree with that person. And I think we're all kind of guilty of this. We become so obsessed with these labels that it's more important than our objectives, some of our policy objectives, but also just what's right. It's really wrong to bring biological men into women's prisons. If that's not cruel and unusual punishment for those female prisoners, I don't know what is. And so I don't care who you are. If you're willing to say that, I think there's across the aisle, we ought to be able to make common cause, politics aside. And sometimes, people are reluctant to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, and those categories become really silly when you're talking about them in terms of like, oh, well, you said a thing that sounds like what this right wing person said. Therefore, like, oh, you and Tucker Carlson agreed on something. Therefore, you're Tucker Carlson. Like you're signing on to all of his politics and beliefs. And I mean, that doesn't make any sense because, I agree with a wide variety of people and a wide variety of things and probably disagree with them on other things. And, we're, for whatever reason, we're so desperate to put people in these very rigid categories and then either include them on our team or kick them off our team. And it's super divisive and it's super unproductive, especially when we're talking about, fundamental women's rights, protecting kids, protecting girls. It's like, well, why can't I agree with this person or work with this person on this one issue and also disagree with them on, like abortion or whatever it is? Like it's just, you're never, and who thinks that they're going to find people who they agree with on everything anyway?
Right. And I think what you're describing is the experience of being online. So when you say, the identity is all that matters and everybody's either in your group or out of your group, well, that's what social media allows. Everyone is either in your friend group or out of your friend group. Everybody is either some tag or not that tag, right? And unfortunately, this younger generation growing up, they don't know that life's not supposed to be like that, that you have annoying neighbors who are nevertheless good and decent and can be of help, even if you agree with them on nothing. And there are like grandparents who say the wrong thing, but are still worthy to be in your life. Like they really just don't seem to know that. And it's just such a loss. It's a loss of the human experience, and the pleasure of each other to know that, God, we're not all perfect, and we're all kind of annoying and we all have dumb ideas about things and that's okay, Like,
and sometimes we change our minds.
And we change, exactly. And we change our minds. I mean, it's just sad to me because, the number of people I'm very close to, but I don't agree with on this or that. I mean, the thought that I would lose their friendship over those disagreements is so sad to me. And yet I think that's what the younger generation is doing.
I think so too. So I want to talk to you about your book, obviously. I wonder, so when you first started researching this phenomenon, I guess of girls wanting to transition to be boys or to be males, what did you find? What did you come across? What kind of data did you discover? What was happening that made you feel like, okay, I have to write a book on this?
Well, Lisa Littman's research, of course, it was so important. I thought I was very compelled not only by her research, but by her as a woman. I mean, I think she's a scientist with amazing integrity. I think, look, there are things I'm good at, the things I'm not. And I think I'm a pretty good judge of people and a judge of character. And I was just immediately thought, wow, she's an impressive person and a person whose work I really want to know. And I think is worth taking very, very seriously. And she just looked at these girls and she saw a pattern. That was it. That's a job of scientists, to investigate patterns they see to see if they're right or what the pattern might mean. And so I just sort of followed that trail. And the more people I talked to, the more that the people I really came to really admire believed her work was very, very good. And the ones who weren't making any sense to me were all seemed to be on the other side. The ones who would immediately discount it or immediately label it transphobic, they didn't seem willing to really push and give me a, an interesting perspective. And that's not to say that everyone I interviewed agreed, even the ones I admire. I mean, they had minor disagreements with, I mean, not minor, but they had big disagreements within them, but at least they were willing to engage and take seriously her hypothesis. And I couldn't believe how many people weren't.
Mm-hmm. And so what was the trend? Like, what was it that
it was
Lisa
all
was
the same
finding?
story? It was like the same story over and over. And by the time I wrote the piece in the Wall Street Journal, I was getting so many dozens of parents contacted me. I guess I fully interviewed a little less than 5 dozen before the book came out, but I was in touch with so many more. And it was always the same story of a precocious young girl who had had no history of gender dysphoria. She had never gone around saying, very often she wasn't even a tomboy. And then this awkward, precocious girl hits adolescence. And all of a sudden she has trouble making friends, and she discovers on the internet these trans influencers, and she sees it as a gateway to popularity. And for the first time, she's celebrated, and she doesn't want to let go.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, what kind of stats are we looking at? I mean, I don't know what stats, how many girls are transitioning today versus 10 years ago?
So, between 2016 and 2017, the number of transgender surgeries on biological women in the United States quadrupled. So we're seeing very, very high numbers. They're saying that, in 2018, 2% of high school students identified as trans. And something came out today in Politico to suggest 1 in 4 are now identifying as, trans or queer or something. These are numbers that don't make any sense in human history. And what's important to note, people always say, oh, there's more acceptance. Well, it's important to note, you're not seeing women in their 40s and 60s coming out with greater acceptance. You're just seeing teenage girls, the same population that gets involved in every other hysteria. So you have to ask, are they being influenced by each other? I mean, girls influence each other. Teenagers influence each other. And it's at least worth exploring that possibility. And that's all I sought to do in the book.
Right. And so, and you said the same population that sort of gets caught up in these other hysterias. I mean, what sort of similar hysterias have you come across that you could compare to this trend of girls identifying as trans?
Well, multiple personality disorder is one, because these were young women in a lot of pain who completely misunderstood the symptoms. I mean, sort of misunderstood the diagnosis. They latched onto this diagnosis they had heard about, this phony ailment, but they convinced themselves they had it. And of course, in conjunction with a lot of therapists, were led down this path that didn't do anyone very much good. But also, of course, anorexia, bulimia, cutting are big ones. It's so funny, even the word hysteria bothers people because it suggests that all women, right, are crazy, in their seat of craziness exists in their uterus or something like that. But of course, you don't have to see it as a negative aspect of womanhood that they take on each other's pain. We know that women become very close. It's why women become so close to their girlfriends. And that's so good for them. It's just that sometimes if one of the girls is going down the wrong path, young women have to know, listen, you can be close to your girlfriend, but you don't have to take on all her pain. You don't have to take on all her bad, behaviors or her bad beliefs about herself. Mm-hmm. And if we're aware of that, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be cloaked in shame. It could just be something that young women are told about.
Mm-hmm. And that comparison to anorexia, I've heard people talk about that in a number of different ways. One of those ways, of course, is, as you've discussed, like that it's a trend. And so girls do it and then their friends do it and then everybody's doing it. But then, also having listened to myself, also to detransitioners, and read their stories, it seems that there's also this common thread of, them having, what some might call gender dysphoria, but also struggling with eating disorders.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, I once had a friend in college it was a guy who used to comment on women's weight a lot. He would comment on women's appearance. And it really bothered me. But it also, I started to realize that it made me really self-conscious. So it wasn't just that he was commenting on other girls, but it was making me self-conscious about my own weight. And I finally told him, like, you have to stop this. It's making me crazy. I know it's a joke to you, like, knock it off. And it's so funny because that's what we do online, right? That's what young girls do online. They see constant comments about other girls' bodies and other women's bodies. And so they're obsessing about their own naturally. I mean, that's what it will do. It make you very self-conscious. So I do think there's a real tie-in with anorexia. And certainly, even the competition, girls, start to have, Lisa Littman talked about this in her research, they start to, compete who can lose the most weight. And certainly you see that in the trans world online with a competition over who can come this close to passing or who's the most hardcore about their testosterone shots and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the other aspect of anorexia is that you can end up delaying puberty and you can end up, preventing your female body from developing properly by starving yourself, which is, of course, sort of similar to what these girls are trying to do with the puberty blockers and testosterone and things like that.
That's a great point. I never thought of that, but it's a great point. I mean, it's hard not to see testosterone as a cure for female puberty to some extent, because not only does it suppress anxiety, depression, which is what these girls are self-medicating for, but it makes you bolder, in a time when girls are naturally awkward. But there's something else too. It suppresses tears. You don't cry as easily. Well, Kira Bell talked about that in her, in her lawsuit in the Times. I mean, that's a huge problem for girls. They're crying all the time in adolescence. A lot of them, especially if they're struggling with mental health issues. And it's like they start testosterone and it's the tears dry up and they think, oh my God, I really am trans. I feel so much better now.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I'm interested in talking to you about what happens when girls start taking testosterone physically, but I actually wasn't aware that there were like personality changes and behavioral changes. How does that work?
They get a boy's swagger.
Huh.
That's what they do. They feel bolder. They get that swagger. That's testosterone. I mean, they walk all of a sudden, instead of walking into a party like this, they're, strutting into a party and feeling great. Everyone's telling them they look great because they're coming across as a young boy. What they don't realize, of course, is that, a lot of women go through those awkward adolescences and they will get there, eventually, but everybody wants it right now. Yeah. And female puberty and adolescence takes a while. It's an emotional struggle, and some people have a harder time with it than others. But there's no short circuiting it. There's no quick fix for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, what a lot of these girls are experiencing is just like they're totally normal experiences that girls have when they're going through puberty. Like, I also did not want to get my period ever and was really upset when it came. And maybe if somebody had offered me a solution back then, I would have been like, great, yeah, I'll postpone this as long as possible, like without having any real idea what the consequences were of that. I guess I wonder what you learned about how schools are participating in this trend of transitioning, specifically, girls.
So, I interviewed a lot of people for the book, and most of them I actually gained a lot of sympathy for and a lot more understanding for. And the one exception, I gained a lot more understanding of the schools, but I was much, much more alarmed by them than when I went in. That was pretty much the biggest example of that. Most times I actually, I interviewed influencers and trans influencers, and I get a lot more understanding and honestly, a lot more sympathy for them. Sorry, but that wasn't true of the schools. And the reason was, is I couldn't believe how aggressively, even in middle school, elementary school, they were participating in keeping things from parents, concealing things from parents. They had this complex of saving children from their parents, from the allegedly unsafe home that they were going back to. I talked to a lot of parents. I didn't talk to one who cut off their transgender child, but I talked to a lot who were cut off by children who decided their parents weren't safe or supportive or allies. And these parents were desperate to get back in touch. And that was much more the norm.
Mm-hmm. What's the process now in terms of, so a girl, let's say, I don't know, she's 14 years old. She decides that she must be transgender. She wants to be a boy. She, maybe she announces this to somebody at school. What happens next?
So one interesting thing that I noticed from when I started the project is that the age is getting younger and younger because they're pushing this in the school system so aggressively. And of course, puberty is coming earlier. And so these girls, so now when that girl first makes the announcement, now it looks like I hear it more and more. It's 12. It's not 14. When I started it was high school where they were first doing this. Now it's certainly middle school. You see huge numbers in middle school. And what they do is they come out as trans and the parent doesn't take it seriously. And they say, okay, honey, whatever, whatever you say, if you want me to call you the pronouns or whatever you want, they sort of go along for a while. Maybe she comes out first as pansexual, or maybe she's gay. And the mom says, okay, that's great. You're experimenting. You'll find yourself, maybe you are gay. That's wonderful. I accept you. But the girl is often very, very sheltered. And actually, she doesn't know she's gay. She's never out of mom's sight. She doesn't really know much about herself sexually at all. And in fact, she's rarely alone with other girls or boys. She's never had a kiss. And she really lives mostly online. And so then this starts escalating because the moment you go online and declare an identity, you are celebrated by so many people, your school, but also adults. They will reach out to you to tell you how brave you are.
Mm-hmm. And what's the process in terms of getting on puberty blockers? Like, how easy is it to access puberty blockers in the US?
That's a good question. I don't know as much about that because the girls I talk to usually are out of the first, the parents of the girls I talk to are usually out of the first two Tanner stages. So they're already far enough along that what they want is testosterone. They've gone through puberty. Mm-hmm. They've had their periods. Puberty blockers is usually before they've even gotten their periods. So it's a little bit younger. And usually that involves parental involvement. Although the disturbing thing is in the United States, it very often requires a child assent to just a child acknowledgement that they're forfeiting their future fertility. And the idea that children are allowed to assent to that at such young ages it's really astonishing.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so what about testosterone? How easy is it to get testosterone?
So easy. So in Oregon, you only have to be 15. You can walk into a clinic and walk out without your parents' permission. It seems to be getting easier and easier. I haven't heard of it confirmed that it's allowable in Washington State at 13, but they are allowed to avail themselves now of mental health services at 13. So presumably that could include a referral for, testosterone. They're allowed to do that without parental permission. But in Oregon, I know it's 15.
And how does testosterone impact the female body, especially when they're, still developing?
Right. So a few ways. First of all, it's a massive dose. It's 40 times what a young woman's body would normally handle. And the real truest answer I can give you is we don't know. This is a massive experiment and all the ramifications are things that are just going to unfold. But we have some idea of the risks. And some of the risks are endometrial cancer, vaginal atrophy, uterine atrophy, because of those atrophies, hysterectomy is often recommended within the first, if you've been on testosterone for 5 years. We know that the risk of heart attack goes way up. We know that facial hair may never go away, and it comes on right away, that the voice doesn't seem to go away, the voice change. And there's changes to the facial features, which do seem to be permanent, though again, this is all still very new.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then the private anatomy, there's clitoral enlargement. It doesn't seem to go away.
Right. I mean, I always find it so frustrating that people act like it's no big deal. Like, people tell me all the time, like, oh, this isn't permanent. Like, it's like you just go on puberty blockers just to, give yourself some time to decide. There's no permanent impacts. It's fine. You just go off them. No big deal. And same thing with the hormones. It's like, well, you can, just go off testosterone. And I don't know why they believe that there's no permanent impacts.
It's astonishing. People who will insist on hormone-free beef will give their children hormones, right, of the opposite sex. It's shocking, right? So they won't eat anything that's been, stuffed full of hormones, but they insist that you try it on their daughter. It's really bizarre. I mean, look, with puberty blockers, we know that it affects bone development. We know that hormones that would naturally shower the brain are not allowed to do that. So we know that there will be massive effects. We just don't know, it's just going to be a while before we know exactly how bad they will be.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I want us to know, but at the same time, I'm not looking forward to finding out, because I feel really heartbroken for all these kids who are going to, they've ruined their bodies for life.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see the parents too, because so many times they tried to stop it. They tried so hard, and instead the state came in and took the child away, or, they were undermined in so many ways by therapists who promised them they wouldn't start, pushing the daughter down this path. And then they overheard a conversation and the therapist was, or doctors who prescribed things that the parents did not want, that tried to block and did not go along with it. I mean, look, I'm a parent, and I would just say that it's bad for these. There's no question it's a lot for these girls to go through, but a lot of them will detransition and they'll be okay. But the parents' heartbreak doesn't seem to, that seems really raw, because it's their kid. They want, it's like their whole world.
Yeah. And it's not even just the permanent impacts of hormones and surgeries, which we can also talk about in a bit, but even binders, I guess, have negative physical impacts. I wonder if you can talk a bit about that.
Sure. They squash your breasts. They deform breast tissue, perhaps permanently. They can cause rib cracking, shortness of breath, all kinds of really nasty things. And then you ask a parent, parents will say to me sometimes, they'll call me and they want advice or something. And I always refer them to a psychologist, because I'm not a psychologist. I don't play psychologist. But sometimes they'll say, please, I still want to know, what can I do? And I will say, why don't you take away her binder? She's 14, take it away. And they'll say to me, oh, I can't do that. And I would say, well, would you let her smoke in the house? Can she smoke cigarettes? Because that's bad for her, but you have no problem prohibiting that. Mm-hmm. These parents feel like they want to be allies. They want to be good guys. And they're not even sure, are they allowed to say no to that? Parents have been so undermined, and they're really not trusting their own judgment about what seems to be very, very wrong for their daughters.
Mm-hmm. And how young are the girls who are starting to get, mastectomies, for example?
So for sure, 16, they can do it without parental permission. Of course, with parental permission, they can do it much younger. Obviously, in California, there have been cases where girls at 13 have done it. So, it depends, but it's young, and it seems to be getting younger. I don't see this. People ask me, is this trend abating? I think it's really just getting going.
That's disturbing. Did you talk to any of the surgeons who were doing these kinds of procedures?
Yeah, I did. I interviewed a few surgeons. One I really profiled in the book, but I interviewed a few. Anyway, yes. And they would tell me, the patients are very happy. I'm supportive of trans rights. I'm giving them what these young people want, and this may be to some extent a male female thing. I don't know. Probably not, because there've been doctors who were not like this, but I can't believe how callous some people are about removing a young girl's healthy breasts as if it's nothing. Even doctors, it's just astonishing, as if there's, nothing of importance there. I mean, it's a major surgery, and it's a major loss.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, are there surgeons that are concerned about all this, like, from an ethical stance?
Absolutely. And I interviewed them in my book as well. And I learned a lot from them. And one of the things I learned, they were kind enough to explain to me, and one surgeon really took me through this. And I believe it was Dr. Patrick Lappert, who really took me through this. And he explained, the breast is a complex organ. It's not just the idea that you can just take off a breast and put it back on with implants. He said the loss is huge. And he explained how the breast structure works, the lobes it's made up of, and the capacity not only for milk and ducts, but also, erotic potential and all these things. It's a complex organ. This is not nothing to lose. And the idea that you can just, take it away, no problem, and if you ever want them later, you can get them back, is really a monstrously, untrue suggestion.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea that a child, a teenager, can make a decision about something that will lead to sterilization, will possibly lead to, adult women who can't achieve orgasm and can't enjoy sex. Like, I don't, if an adult wants to have these surgeries, wants to take hormones, then that's their prerogative. I definitely think that we should be having more conversations about the health implications of all this transitioning stuff. And obviously there's many other conversations to be had, but, an adult has the right to get cosmetic surgeries, if they want to take these hormones. I'm not out there trying to stop them, but I don't think that any minor, so I suppose anybody under voting age should be allowed to make these decisions. Like, that's crazy to me. Like, you're not equipped to make these kinds of decisions about your entire life when you're like 14, 15, 16 years old.
And the parents who are going along with it for minor children, like the puberty blockers, are in some instances remarkably incurious about things like what's going to happen to their capacity for orgasm. And there's a real chance it may eliminate it. And, they'll say to me, oh, my kid can always adopt later. Who cares? I understand that's a loss, but they can always adopt kids. But to go through a life with a very limited where sex is really not that appealing to you, that's a really different life. It's a huge loss. I mean, how you just give that up sign that away for your child. It's really concerning.
Yeah, it is a major loss, and it seems like nobody's really talking about it or thinking about it, or very few of us are in any case. I wonder if you found that, people will say that it's important for some kids, some teenagers, to transition when they're young because this is what will improve their mental health. Like, first of all, they'll say, well, if they wait until they're adults, it'll be too late, because they'll already have started developing as a woman, as a man, in ways they don't want to be developing when they're identifying as the opposite sex or gender, however you want to say it. But they'll also say that, like, this is in their best interest. What kind of evidence did you find around that claim?
I'm so glad you said that. Okay, two things. One, the suicide rates, there's no proof that mental health is improved by transition, certainly not with this population. But there's another thing, and I love that you brought that up. What you often hear is this argument for puberty blockers. adult transgender people will claim that they wish they had never gone through male puberty because now they have a 5 o'clock shadow and whatnot and can never really present as a woman. Therefore, we should sort of intervene earlier. The problem is what we've done is we've taken a full adult man's perspective to guide the treatment that we're giving to these young girls. See, that girls don't have that effect. They don't have that problem. Testosterone really does transform them, and they do look like smaller men, right? They don't have the same issue of the 5 o'clock shadow. And by the time, and they're going to need a, so we're using the rationale that might make sense for an adult transgender biological male, trans woman, but biological male. And we're imposing it. We're using it as a rationale for intervening in the medical care of young girls. No one points that out. It's crazy. They should not be guiding their medical treatment.
Yeah. You're right. It's totally different. And I mean, do you think that, I'm just asking for your opinion, I suppose, but do you think that there are ever circumstances where it is appropriate to start a minor on transition?
So I have never taken a position about that. I'm agnostic about it. That was not the population I looked at. And I think that's a very complicated issue that you would have to go into the homes. I'd have to know a lot more about the homes and the condition of true childhood gender dysphoria, which is a classic diagnosis. It's been around for a long time and there's a lot of literature on it. And I do think it exists. And whether that's the proper intervention for some number of kids, I don't know. So that's not something I've ever taken a position on. I'm only looking at, these adolescent girls who don't seem to have real gender dysphoria and all, and why they don't have any safeguards and whether they're getting the care they need.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I listened to your interview on Rogan, and he does this kind of, there's real transgender and there's fake transgender. And so I get the impression he thinks that, like if there was such a thing as like a way to determine who is really trans and who's not, maybe it's okay to start them on transition, which is something, I mean, I disagree with the concept of transgender itself. I think it's like too incoherent to be able to have any kind of conversation like that to determine who is real trans and who's not.
I agree with that it's very, the language here is so confusing. Sometimes it's deliberately so, right? And it is hard because what you're saying is if you could know given that most of these kids will outgrow gender dysphoria, I don't know why you would intervene personally in general. As a general matter, it would seem that given that the vast majority of these kids, upwards of 70%, some studies say upwards of 80% will outgrow it on their own if left alone. To me, that would seem roll the dice, don't do anything, would seem a really safe bet. But I've never said no child should ever be, transitioned because I feel like I would have to, know a lot more about childhood gender dysphoria.
I wonder if you could maybe talk about some stories. You talk to a lot of girls, obviously. Some stories that really stood out for you in terms of the research that you did for this book, and these girls who were transitioning or detransitioning. Yeah,
there's a few. I guess there's so many at this point, but I guess. Well, certainly, Desmond, the woman who woke up with a hysterectomy and realized this whole thing had been a mistake. She'd started a course of testosterone at, I guess, 18 after being celebrated and convinced, by a therapist. She agreed with the therapist. She came out as trans and everybody celebrated her, and her testosterone caused her so much cramping, and she ended up with a hysterectomy. She needed one, and woke up devastated, realizing this had been the wrong path. But there were so many of these, and there were so many detransitioners. And since I wrote the book, there are so many women who've reached out to me who said, that was exactly my experience. Or I got one yesterday. Actually, I got a message yesterday from someone who said that she had just met up. She was a lesbian, and she had met up with an old girlfriend who was very troubled. I guess she had been her girlfriend in high school and had a lot of mental health issues, and she hadn't seen her in a while, and then reconnected with her after this young woman had transitioned. And she just said she was such a confused person and suffering with so many things. And I can't believe, before she sorted out her mental health issues, that any psychologist would have pushed her down this path or encouraged her down this path while she still had so many mental health problems. And the young woman was kind of devastated for her and for her friend. And, those kinds of things are really sad to read,
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been asked by several people, because as you know, parents are struggling so much with their kids, with their girls in particular, coming to them and saying, I want to transition. And they don't know what to do because it seems like everybody's kind of on board with this. And so they're looking for, I've been asked, like, do you know of any therapists or psychologists who won't push her down this path, who won't, support the transition, who will sort of challenge her on this? I don't even know if you're allowed to challenge kids on this anymore. Did you come across any therapists or psychologists who were pushing back?
Yes, and I recommend parents to them, but I will tell you that just yesterday I got a note from a physician who said that in Virginia, because of conversion therapy laws and the rules there, it's become impossible for doctors to do anything but immediately infirm because they're really afraid they're going to lose their licenses. And this is a real problem. The suppression of speech in America, and that, and that's what it is. It's speech. When you're not entitled to give your professional opinion, which is, hold on, you're 14. Okay, let's do a differential diagnosis and figure out really what your medical problems are, as opposed to rubber stamping. You're really, taking away a doctor's ability to exercise their judgment.
Yeah, totally. Are there people that you recommend that you can say publicly or no?
For sure. I always recommend, for sure. Obviously Ken Zucker, Sasha Ayad. There's so many that I really, respect very much. Stella O'Malley in Ireland is wonderful. I know Lisa Marciano, who's absolutely wonderful. She mainly works with the parents. I think, she doesn't see adolescents, but she talks to parents. But, are there a lot of them? No, unfortunately there aren't. I mean, it's funny. I once got a call from a therapist who said to me, I was trying to interview her because I reached out to her. Actually, I was reaching out to lots and lots of gender therapists at the time. And for my book, and I reached out to her, and I thought she was someone who sort of, from her description of her job or herself on her website, I thought it said she was affirmative care and blah, blah, blah. Well, as I interviewed her, I realized she wasn't comfortable with this at all and didn't agree with it, but she wasn't able to advertise herself that way. So when I asked her any questions about this, it clearly was not that she agreed with it. So, I mean, these therapists feel so hemmed in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's it would be really a tough position to be in. I wonder if you had any trouble finding a publisher for the book.
So I did. I definitely did. People ask me about all the time. It's so funny. People don't realize that, yeah, it was hard. I mean, when I started out with this, I wrote a proposal, and within the first 24 hours, I had immediate interest. I think my agent had just sent out my proposal, and it was a big publishing agency. And that was a really big deal for me. It was a first book. So I was so happy. I talked to the head of the publishing agency right away, and I just thought, oh my God, I can't believe they're so excited. He had read something about the phenomenon, and he was familiar with it. And he said, I really like this idea. I think your treatment is very fair. From what I've read, because you have to submit a whole proposal. So he had a sense of the book. He said, this seems to be a very fair treatment, and I want to do this. I'll call your agent. We talked for over an hour, and I waited, and I didn't get an offer. And 2 days later, my agent called me and said his staff had threatened to walk out. They said, absolutely not. And then that sort of repeated itself with other agencies. Now, I ended up with a conservative publisher who right away said that they would stand by me. They were interested in the issue. And I had seen that they had stood by other very controversial authors before. I actually don't consider myself a controversial author. I'm not a provocateur. I don't like fighting with people. Part of the reason I wrote this is because I think in 10 years, this is going to be the most non-controversial thing. It's just going to be so obvious to everyone. But right now it happens to fall into this weird time where it counts as controversial.
Yeah, totally. I also don't understand the controversy, especially, you're not sharing your opinions, you're sharing stories and information and data. I guess they tried to cancel Rogan just for talking to you.
They tried to cancel Rogan. Well, they have a sense that they can't, right? So there was a huge blackout on my book, a huge media blackout, meaning I had a lot of top journalists write to me and ask for advance copies. And that didn't mean they were going to like the book. I'm not saying they all love my book. I have no idea. But they requested advance copies and they were determined to explore the issue and write about it. Okay, maybe they wouldn't have liked the book. I don't know, because they never got to write about it. And so I checked in with them after my book came out. I was waiting and was just waiting for some mainstream, reviews. I thought I was going to get a review and nothing came. So kind of sheepishly, I got back in touch. Like, I'm so sorry. I hate to ask, but I guess you didn't like the book, and they each told me, no, we were told we couldn't review it. And Kirkus, which is, of course, a pro forma review, they review 10,000 titles a year. Kirkus reviews unpublished books. Self-published books. 10,000 titles a year. They didn't review mine.
That's nuts. Why do you think this is so controversial right now? Like, why do you think that we're not allowed to talk about this? We're not, you're not allowed to publish research about it. Like, as we've witnessed in terms of what happened to Lisa Littman, for example. Because
every time they get someone fired from the New York Times, like a top editor, like James Bennett, they claim a victory and they say, wow. And if we can get people to say men or women, we can do anything. I think that's part of it. It's this amazing gaslighting. They can say up is down. I mean, they can force you to say men or women. And every time we hand them a victory, they get stronger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What has the response been like, aside from the silence and the media blackout?
You know what? Thank God. It's been great. I'm really touched. Parents really like the book. People really like the book. Transgender adults really like the book. So I've had so many interesting conversations with trans adults, and they are lovely, by the vast majority of transgender adults I've ever talked to are just such lovely people. And we've had the most interesting conversations. And they can handle it. And it's always respectful and it's always interesting. And very often they agree with me or they really like the book and they're not afraid of it. These aren't fragile. You're not fragile. If you can go out there and present yourself as a woman for your life, or a man, you're a tough person and they can take it. It's really generational. It's these young woke activists who are driving everything. And a lot of them aren't even trans.
Yeah. Finally, where do you see this going? Like, how do you see all this playing out? Is there an end in sight, and what will that look like?
So everyone predicts, and I think this is right, that it will end with lawsuits in the United States because we're so into our lawsuits here. The problem is that while we're really gung-ho about lawsuits, we do seem to be less responsive to data. Our science has become so thoroughly corrupted. And I'm not sure it's as bad in places like England, where the Tavistock Clinic is doing a major review of whether these puberty blockers, they're really seriously considering in England outlawing puberty blockers based on data, based on what they're hearing. And in America, I don't see scientists taking this seriously, that there's a lot of indication that this is not helping this population. And I don't see open inquiry about that in America yet. So I think this phenomenon is just getting going, especially because I'm seeing huge numbers in middle school. And I do think it's going to be a little while before this really dangerous trend finally reverses.
That's unfortunate. But I mean, I'm glad that we're having the conversations, and I'm really grateful that you did all this research and that you published this book. I think it's really important, just for anyone watching.
Thank you. You know, I have to tell you something. Your example is so meaningful. I can't tell you. I've been a huge fan of yours for a long time, and it's wonderful to be in touch with you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's so great to be in touch with you. I'm so glad that we talked. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on.
And for your work. Okay, great. Bye-bye.
Take care.